Hey everyone, Zach here. Today I'm going to walk through a quick demo of how you can simplify your configuration as code using the AAP MCP Server. If you're like me, you really love configuration as code, but you don't necessarily like writing configuration as code, I found this to be an amazing benefit of AI to be able to leverage the AAP MCP to turn resources that I've created in the UI manually as I'm kind of working through a problem and just generate the config as code for me in the style that I want consistently and using the proper formatting. So with that, let me dive through a couple of prereqs. First thing is you will need an AAP instance and you'll want to deploy the MCP server. I've got a couple of configs here for how you could do this, both if you're doing the containerized deployment or if you're deploying it via the operator. My example is using the containerized version, but ultimately you just need the AAP MCP server deployed somewhere where it's connected to an AAP instance and that you can also connect to it from your IDE. You can validate the setup, so I put some commands in here that you could run on a terminal just to check, have I correctly set up my MCP server. I'll hop into my terminal. I went ahead and created a script for those commands that you see in the blog, and I can run it and I can see that the API is up, I got a session ID, and then I was able to fetch some tools, which is abbreviated, but I can see that it is exposing tools to the client, which in this case is just the terminal. So hop back to the post. That just validates that everything's working. So the next piece is we have to hook it into our IDE. So if I scroll down is where I get into configuring the client. In my use case, I'm using Cursor, but it's pretty standard at this point for a lot of the different AI tools to have what's called an mcp.json. So the example I'm going to show you would apply to any tool that consumes that, just where you put it may be slightly different. So you can see a snippet here. And notice that I am using environment variables. That is so I don't have secrets in my config. I've got a link here if you're a Mac user where I can actually set environment variables anytime launchctl is invoked. So whenever you basically click an icon on your computer, and that handles making sure that these get injected to my application environment and my app is able to then connect to the MCP servers. There are various ways you could do this. I'm not going to go into all of them, but that's just how I've set it up. So I'll show you in Cursor really quickly what this looks like. So in Cursor, if I go to Cursor Preferences and Cursor Settings, there is a tab called Customize, which is the tab that I'm in here. And you'll see I've got this MCPs subsection. And I've got various tools set up here. One thing that's nice within Cursor and many harnesses, you can actually pick the tools you want to enable. So there are actually way more tools here than I have checked. So you'll see like 1, 6, 9 for the different tool sets. If I click on one of these, you'll see there's a lot of them that I have disabled simply because I'm not using them and I don't want to waste tokens loading those tools. So the next thing I'll do is just quickly show you what the cursor.json actually looks like in full. So this is the raw file that the snippet is from in the blog post, where I've got all the different tool sets available to me, and you can find this documentation on Red Hat as well. And then I'm basically configuring a name for my tool sets that will actually be showing up in the browser or in the cursor itself, whereas I've got the name that the MCP server is exposing here. And if I scroll down, that's pretty much it. So once I've set that up, and if I come into Customize, Cursor is telling me, hey, this is working. So this is a green little circle here. If you had any issues, go through some of the troubleshooting guides, use AI to help you kind of sort it out. But ultimately, as long as you have a valid AAP token, which is coming from AAP itself, and you have access to that MCP server, you should be able to connect relatively easily. And you can do a read-only token. If you just want to do read-only operations, you can also enable write operations as well. So if we scroll down here, I can validate the client setup really easily. So if I go into Cursor, I can just say, let me go into ask mode. What tools are available via the AAP MCP server, and let it go to work. I happen to be using as my model Cloud Opus. For this type of question, I probably could have used a lighter model. I typically use Opus for planning, and then I use a less expensive model for the actual implementation. So in this case, for an ask, I probably would have used the lightest possible model. But you can see here that it actually was able to go in and say, okay, here's the tool sets that you have configured, and here's all the tools available to you, and gave me a brief description. So a cool way to use AI to learn a little bit about the AI itself. This is also a good validation. This is validation that everything's hooked up correctly. So now I can come into the fun part, and I've got this skill written, which is effectively how I have defined and codified a repeatable process that I want AI to be able to do. So for me, that process is go to AAP, find the resources that I created manually using the MCP server, pull those down, and then convert them into the configuration as code variables that the infra.aap configuration collection expects. I also have added some preferences. So I've got key ordering so that all of my configuration is very consistent. An example being that the first key is always name, second key is always description, I believe the third key is always organization, and then maybe for different resource types I might have other particular keys that I want in a particular order, and then at the end I just say, alphabetize the keys. But setting this in a skill makes it very repeatable, and so I can just use natural language to say, like, go give me those configs and generate them for me. I don't have to think too much about it. So an example being, I have in the blog post just a very quick, provide me the configs for EE default. So that's my EE resource in AAP. And you can see it went, it followed some of the instructions in the skill. It omitted defaults, so that's one thing I don't like. You could also say include all defaults if you like to be very explicit. And it generated the config as code. So the next thing I'm going to do is I've actually gone ahead and created a branch where I deleted several resources, and I'm going to go ahead and recreate that configuration as code. So this / command allows me to invoke a skill, which I've named CAC parser. Create the resources for my business process automation examples. So I have a bunch of resources in my AP that kind of fall within this business process domain, and I'm going to see how Opus does as far as planning out based on the resources that exist in AP, what that config needs to be. You'll also potentially notice on the left side here, I have my configuration organized in my repository into domains. Again, that's a personal preference, so if you do try to use this skill, you may want to take a look at how I've organized it, and you may tweak it, or you may want to use it. One of the things that I'm leveraging is the wildcard variable support in the infra AAP configuration collection, which allows you to kind of merge together multiple variable files, as opposed to kind of in earlier phases of the collection, you had to have a single explicit variables file for a resource type. So I couldn't necessarily split up my credential types by domain, which, for example, for credential types or maybe job templates, you could end up with a super long file. That's really where I like the wildcard vars and the domain-specific organization. That's going. I'm going to take a break and let it work, and then I'll come back when the plan is ready.
Book applied.
All right, so our plan is ready. You can see that it came up with a business process automation domain. It said recreate because this is in that repository. And as I mentioned, I actually deleted several files before this, kind of to prep for the demo to recreate them. So it knows about the Git history. It went and found a bunch of the resources in AAP, and it's listing them out for me. So it needs to create a project, it needs to create a credential type, 2 credentials. One of them that is using my custom credential type in this domain, one that's using a common credential type, so it falls in the common domain, a job template, and then a schedule as well, right? And so it gives me a nice list of the files to create. It says, hey, I'm going to follow your key ordering. I'm also going to add to the Ansible playbook for applying configuration as code, a task that allows you to run just the business domain. And if I click build here, this is very common. I'll let Sonic go ahead and do the implementation. So it'll go and crank out all the configuration as code. It's also aware of my documentation style, so it'll create a README in the particular domain, or it'll add to an existing README if it is already there. And it's also aware of like parent domains, so it'll know, okay, I've got a top level domain that needs to reference or I've got a top level README for the repository that needs to reference each of the domains, so it'll make edits there. But if I go into my business, you can see it's already cranking out files. It's got a new README here. I've got projects, so this is my project. You'll notice name came first, organization second. name, org, description. So I think I was a little bit off earlier. It's name, org, then description. But this is my configuration as code. So this is really how I do things now. I don't necessarily write the configuration as code or go into Postman and pull the configs out and do it manually. I just let the MCAP server work with AI to generate the configuration once I've got everything working in my kind of sandbox environment, and I've tweaked things to my liking. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it's a fun way for you to integrate AI into your workflow and actually create some efficiency for you. Thanks for watching.